Chapter 2. Leaving the Soulcage, crawling out of the console, was always a disorienting experience, especially after being Soulcaged as a battle robot. Gasping and shivering, he lethargically made his way out and down onto his mattress. His body felt like a worn-out, meaty puppet. His human sensations were suddenly overwhelming and bizarre, and his confined spherical space raged with claustrophobia. It was time for his lunch break. Each meal, of course, consisted of one near-identical food block and one water block. The lunch food block had a slight taste of beef to it, and once he'd eaten it, he'd practically forgotten about it. After lunch, he went back inside the Soulcage for another shift, praying he'd be sent somewhere new. But no such luck. The day was all battles. Battles on that terrible African war front. Whoever was watching his feed always managed to switch him out of a body before he was killed, which was a small mercy compared to the morning. There wasn't much thinking throughout all the battling. There was no time and no point to thought. He just followed orders and savored each time he was put into a new pain-free body. He would bring his mind to a state of non-feeling and non-comprehending, steeled impatience, until at last the time was up and he was back in the cell again. The dinner food was soupy and vaguely tomatoey, while the water block he was surprised to find had a dull wine flavor. It had seemed like ages since he was given one, but he recalled then that he was administered one every weekend. That was part of how he was sure he'd been here for a month. It wasn't very good, but it was different, and therefore mildly appreciated. After dinner came the final shift, in which Montgomery spent another hour raiding a supply depot on the African coast not too far from the earlier war front. It was less bloody than the morning and afternoon skirmishes, only robots against robots, and he only switched bodies once. The sun had just set when they'd won, and all the robots were shut down, probably to be inhabited again moments later by Soulcage users in a different time zone. Montgomery crawled out of the Soulcage once more with numb and trembling limbs, so hazily sapped of energy that he slipped and fell, thankfully hitting bullseye onto his mattress pad. With the day's work finally done, there would only be another hour or two of light in the cell before bedtime. Montgomery wouldn't wait. After so long not using the Soulcage, he'd grown unaccustomed. He was weak, beaten to the bone. His mind raced with torrential confusion, horror, and violence. He lay on his back in an angel pose and breathed in and out slowly, eyes dead shut. His body was slick with sweat. Horrible convulsions came on, threatening to ignite a panic attack. The Soulcage, the Soulcage, the Soulcage. Tears pushed out of his eyes. He let them fall. No one who saw would care, and no one who cared would see. One more day endured. Somewhere, in the back of his mind, Montgomery knew he was dreaming, but he didn't encourage the lucidity. He let it sit. He was back home in the West Dominance, in the Canadian province. Previously his refuge when the wars had been less frequent and patriotism meant building up your own conglomerate nation. Something about the dream was strange, however, and he realized after a while that he wasn't in Canada at all, as he assumed he was. He was somewhere in the central province. Why else would he be seeing the Statue of Liberty in this wide, wide building, laying prone in its decommissioned state? Its broken, bomb-blasted face looked at him, sadly, wondering along with him why they were here. He saw ghostly images of friends and family he knew, but somehow could not recognize. Their true identities eluded him. Still, they talked and toured the place like they were on vacation. Something about it all was vaguely peaceful. A memory of brighter times, perhaps. But the peace was brittle. Lucidity gnawed at him, and drawing closer to the forefront of his sleeping mind was the prescient knowledge that his body was trapped. Forever in that coppery cell, doomed to live out the lives of robots, androids, and humans that were not his own. He abandoned his family, ran to the closest door, and passed by dozens of street tourists until he was suddenly inside a quiet, humble studio apartment, familiar and alien at the same time. Here the illusion of peace faded completely, yet he felt no danger, just stasis. That effortless balance of emotions disturbed him. He wanted it to end. But when he woke up, he hated himself for so readily escaping the peace of dreams. The cell was cold. He stretched out his legs and his bare toes and then made his way to the water closet, his head throbbing and his joints aching more than they seemingly ever had before. As the hygienic trimming device clamped over his head and left him clean-shaven and with hair shortened, he dully wondered how he could face one more day, even a single other day, in the Soulcage, in this prison cell, in this horrid, never-ending war. "Lucky day, Geo9," said the guard, a new smirking face, when he appeared at the door. "I hear your block's not going into the war today." Montgomery said nothing as the guard popped food and water blocks through the slot. He took them and sat next to the Soulcage. The food block tasted mutedly of yogurt, almost pleasant except for a strange aftertaste he couldn't place. He washed it down such as he could with the water block. Even luckier, the guard continued. I heard a rumor that you're getting a special job sometime soon. Montgomery stared at him. Your Soulcage date has impressed some bigwigs. I have a feeling you might enjoy what they have in mind, so be good, or you might not get the chance, said the guard with a smile. Maybe you'll even fall in love. He stepped away without another word, and Montgomery quickly forgot his face. But he didn't forget what the man had said. Fall in love? Why would he say something like that? Before long, Montgomery cast it out of his mind. There was no sense speculating. For all he knew, it was merely a prank. By the time he was ordered to climb into the Soulcage console again, Montgomery's aches had nearly subsided. He felt like a ghost as he entered the console. Settling back in the seat, he dared to hope that the Soulcage would take a long time to warm up. But as if in mockery of that wish, it took only a few seconds instead. He felt his soul get swept away, sucked into a figurative vacuum tube, and sent somewhere far, far away. Another body introduced itself to Montgomery, and another sensation, this time one of suspension. He hung in the air on a hook in some kind of dimly lit, junky structure. Below him he saw his iron-rusted limbs dangling down toward a dirt-covered floor, and just ahead the structure opened up into a scrapyard underneath a gray sky. Although robotic just as the BattleBot body had been, this new frame was totally unique in feel. There was a different weight to it, different information preloaded in the mind, and slightly worse hearing. His sight wasn't 360 degrees around, but a more conventional sight from two round and hollow glass eyes facing forward, tinted slightly brown. He was dropped from the hook quite suddenly, and his mechanical knees buckled underneath him from the 8-foot fall. He stood up and stepped out into the scrapyard, where gentle rain was falling. By a bus parked 25 feet ahead to his 10 o'clock, he saw a herd of smaller robots, most humanoid in shape but some on wheels, climbing or rolling into the back. Today was the scrapyard. Montgomery hadn't entirely believed the guard when he said today wasn't a war day, but the man had been telling the truth. About that, at least. Well, there was no sense in delaying the day's work. He walked awkwardly ahead. This body wasn't meant for quick or nimble movement, and it was certainly not something with a price tag at all comparable to the robotic foot soldiers. It was merely functional. His head began to buzz and reverberate with an intrusive thought, commanding him to move to the bus. He complied. It would be foolish to hope they did not have cameras installed in this robot's eyes, live-streaming everything he saw to some company headquarters. Besides, even if he ran, it wasn't really him running. However far he got, the real him wouldn't be free. His real body was elsewhere. He didn't even know where either body was in particular. The prison housing the Soulcage-equipped cell Montgomery's body was in was an army headquarters, a veritable fortress stationed in the Britain district. But where precisely that was, he had no way of knowing. It could be on any part of the island or around it. He guessed that he was now standing somewhere in the Britain district, judging by the style of the architecture he saw beyond the borders of the scrapyard. Maybe this was old London, one of the few major old cities spared from nuclear attacks. The sky was certainly dreary enough for it. Slim raindrops splattered on his head. One rolled painlessly down his glass eye. He wondered what it smelled like, what it tasted like. A rush of memory flowed through him as he approached the grey bus. Yes, this was old London. He was soul-caged as a supervisor robot for the Uranaka Corporation. He'd done this before, in this very scrapyard, no less. It was one of the first jobs he remembered doing while in captivity. Why were the memories coming back so scattered? Surely this torture he'd suffered hadn't been that severe, had it? He clambered into the back of the bus, the last robot to enter, and was grabbed by two mechanical arms on rails in the ceiling that carried him to the front. There were no seats, only hooks and clamps keeping each robot in place. The arms took him to where a driver might have sat in an old manual bus many years ago, and lifted him up onto another hook. Once he was secure, hanging limply, the bus took off onto a dirty old London street, filtering into fast-flowing traffic seamlessly and gliding down quiet silvery roads. Montgomery once again found he had no mouth to speak with, so he said nothing. The rain picked up. He looked out the window and tried to feel something. It was especially difficult in these sorts of bodies, with programmed minds that literally weren't capable of processing the complex human feelings and thoughts that would stream in, along with the occupant's consciousness, through the magic of the Soulcage. Soulcages had a serious effect upon the minds of those who used them. In truth, those who soul-caged as robots often were in danger of losing their grasp on their emotions unless they were blessed to inhabit a more sophisticated robot body, usually called an android, or, heavens permit, a human body. Usually Montgomery soul-caged as a battle robot, which was capable of processing sophisticated emotions, yes, but only not the sorts one wanted to feel. On good days, he was a cleanup robot and didn't have to worry about emotions. And on a very good day, he was an android and could pretend to some degree that he was a human being. The rest of the robots around him were dull and lifeless. He already knew, presuming this was anything like his last cleanup job with the Uranaka Corps, that none of them were soul-caged, just regular, simple-minded droids. Mentally, he shut his eyes. He couldn't mimic the action physically. Leaned back and thought back to soul-cage jobs from some weeks ago before the torture. The memories felt separate from him, but he recalled them just the same. Once, on a particularly memorable job, Montgomery had been soul-caged as a cleanup robot for Uranaka in the Israeli-Palestinian district. He remembered keenly the dust that hung in every square inch of the air, the horrible blackened state of every standing structure, and the complete and utter lack of life of any kind anywhere. He and a group of mindless droids had scooped up radiation and sent it away to be collected and disposed of. The sun burned red in the sky, and Montgomery had almost wished he had a way to feel the air on his skin and smell the scents in his nostrils. It would have made a memorable job that much more memorable. He wouldn't have cared if he'd gotten poisoned and died. Better that than to return to the soul cage day after day. Presently, a voice crackling with audio static buzzed in his mind. "Geo9." It was a woman's voice, spoken like she was reading off a list. "My records show you've worked here before, almost a month ago." So it had been a month after all. Yes, he thought. In this body, his thoughts could appear on a screen for them to read. Although he understood that only the non-abstract ones would actually come through, he assumed they were telling him the truth about that. Supervise the droids and watch for thieves. They're expected to finish at 1300 hours. The voice died and he almost felt like nodding. Something in him wanted to do a good job, probably just programming. Instead of feeling the excitement they wanted him to feel, he let his body hang limp as a fish, tilting on the hook with each turn of the bus. This body's capacity to feel pain or discomfort was greatly reduced from that of the battle bots. That was probably one of the many reasons why he couldn't help but feel empty nothingness on jobs like these. They forced you to do physical labor, but at least they let you be in charge of a troop of droids who did most of it for you. And at least they had the decency to prevent you from feeling pain. In a way, this numbness was catharsis. Montgomery remembered his first time being soul-caged as a battle bot. At first it seemed like it would be less terrifying than being a flesh and blood human in the same scenario. After all, you were effectively immortal, reconstructible. But when he was lit up with bullets like Pollock splatters, he discovered the truth. They didn't dull the pain much at all. They lessened it enough that you could go on when really hit hard, but didn't turn it off, nor keep it so low that it only felt like being touched or pinched. It wasn't merely to torture you, he had learned. They wanted you to still be scared of death. Soldiers would fight better when they could still feel great amounts of pain. Yes, taking pain away could prompt them to take more risks during battle, but that was a double-edged sword in itself. Riskier fighting wasn't always conducive toward success. And for those who didn't want to take risks regardless, feeling no pain when hit made them apathetic, almost docile. The bus reached its destination and let the droids out, dropping them off their hooks and carrying them to the ground one at a time. Montgomery leapt out of the door and saw a pit of rubble in the midst of the city between two stately brick buildings. This middle one had burnt down. A small crowd of onlookers still stared at it. It must have occurred less than an hour ago. The droids ambled or rolled their way down the decline into the pit. Montgomery followed after them, his rusty legs bouncing with skeletal springs. Light rain splattered and washed down their heads. The humanoid droids with arms began pushing large pieces of rubble and debris, while the ones on wheels swept up smaller pieces. Montgomery went to help the humanoid ones, pushing smoldering black chunks of brick and mortar with his strength-enhanced upper body. Amid the rubble he found charcoal-colored televisions, computers, and service droids, children's toys and gadgets. It was extremely unlikely to have been an accident. This was most certainly a case of arson, probably politically motivated. All the people would have gotten out in time. Escape systems were too advanced these days for that to be an issue, but arsonist techniques had advanced too, and made a fire that the firemen couldn't put out quickly enough. That was only a guess, of course. Montgomery only knew about as much as these brainless droids with his thinking impaired. Several of the wheeled ones got stuck rolling over a lumpy line of steel framing half buried in the ash. Montgomery stepped over and helped, righting the ones that had fallen on their sides. Occasionally, the humanoid robots would be unsure what to do next. When that happened, Montgomery would send commands to them via thought. Only simple orders would make it through. It was impossible for him to start a robot uprising, for example, assuming that had taken his fancy this morning. When thought commands didn't go through or weren't computed, he would guide them with his hands and show them what to pick up, or point to where to take it. They got the picture after some effort. He kept an eye on the onlookers, hoping and praying that they would keep their distance. On occasion, some desperate and foolish soul tended to rush down to these sorts of cleanups and try to nab one of the smaller robots to make some quick cash. The last time Montgomery had seen someone try that, he'd been forced to chase the man down and punch him in the back of the head. The man had actually died. His skull was fractured by the blow, and a quick trip to the hospital hadn't saved him. It was Montgomery's first or second time at a cleanup. He'd had no way of knowing what his strength was as this variety of robot. Under normal circumstances, Montgomery was sure he'd be prosecuted for manslaughter or some such crime. But, well, he was already a prisoner of war. His captors had simply paid a fine and let the case stand as a public warning against other would-be crooks. Droids' artificial intelligence systems were not perfected quite yet. Montgomery doubted that they ever would be, really. Robots were greatly useful, such that they had changed the face of manual labor throughout the entire world, but they made constant mistakes humans wouldn't make. On the other hand, they never made other kinds of mistakes that human error would cause all the time. So almost every company that could benefit from it had decided to employ a hybrid of robotic and human labor, often through the Soulcage, due to how convenient and safe that was compared to employing an on-the-site human, with physical needs and susceptibility to harm and death. Humans who did not want a Soulcage still found plenty of work, however, since Soulcage users were limited, greatly limited. It was about a decade now since the Soulcage technology had been made widely available, and it seemed to Montgomery that the possibilities it gave to industry and society weren't blossoming or expanding quite as quickly as all the invested parties had hoped. The reason was simple. Most people couldn't use soul cages. They tried. Of course they tried. It was one of, if not the highest paid, lowest skilled job in existence. But problems kept arising for too many aspiring soul cages. It was physically taxing first and foremost. Even those who could withstand soul cage use dealt with that to a degree. But for most people, even relatively short usages wiped them out like they had just endured a non-stop 14-hour workday. Those who couldn't use soul cages themselves could make nearly as much money as those who could by simply offering their bodies to be inhabited by soul cagers in order to facilitate all kinds of soul cage scenarios in which using a robot body was not preferred. In some cases, these soul cage host bodies would actually make more money than soul cagers themselves. But there were always important jobs that only soul cagers could do, so there were always those relative few who pushed past the exhaustion for the money. But before long it was discovered that prolonged use could sometimes bring about even worse side effects than exhaustion. The best known case was that of a Westerner woman named Lila Moon, who had been using a soul cage 8 hours a day for just over a week when she suddenly lost her memory entirely. Not just her memory, but most of her human functioning. She had willingly soul caged as a synthetic android prostitute, taking jobs from all over the world during a period where the wars were less severe. It wiped her out every day, but she was quickly growing rich, and to top it all off, she didn't have to use her own body for the job. One morning, while soul caged, she suddenly forgot who she was. Her identity outside the soul cage, her very name, was lost in the deepest recesses of her mind, trapped beneath her understanding of the body and identity she was currently in. Even returning to her body didn't fix her. That afternoon she woke up from the console and didn't exit. Someone pulled her out and found her unresponsive. Relatives came to visit her in the hospital. When she saw them, she didn't recognize them. She was completely convinced that she was what she had been soul caging as, a robot prostitute. From then on, she saw herself as merely a synthetic android with no personality and no directives or goals or relationships, other than those she was programmed with. It hit the news almost as hard as the war declarations would a year or so later. Soul cage companies stepped back and reassessed what they thought they understood about the technology. The Moon family sued and won an obscene sum of money. Poor Lila, who had gone back to work at her own insistence, died of a sexually transmitted disease 5 years later. She had been certain that it was impossible for her to die of disease. Other issues turned up from a few other cases. Someone from the India district in the Slav Asian preeminence got brain damage from soul caging as an android programmed to mimic the mind of a famous historical military tactician. A man from the Australia district, back when it was still part of Greater Europa, who'd soul caged into his girlfriend's bodies for fun, developed a split personality disorder that later developed into major schizophrenia. Soul cage companies were forced to turn the technology into something used only with extreme caution after multiple rounds of testing and certification. Those certified to use soul cages who'd proven that they could do so without suffering adverse effects had to renew their certification twice a year, which was demanding. When soul cages first came out, Montgomery had tried it once out of curiosity, but discovered he disliked the technology. He didn't think he'd used one for 5 or 6 years when he was captured and forced to endure testing at the hands of the Europeans. Why, then, he couldn't help but wonder, did soul cage use feel so natural to him? Why was he so remarkably, mysteriously proficient at it? There was a certain mystique attached to the soul cage and those gifted with its use. They were never in want for a job, although some were less savory than others, and all of them paid well. Beyond the financial boons, it was a marvelous job, according to some. Those who did not have to go to war with it found themselves able to live all sorts of different lives they wouldn't otherwise be able to live. A surprising memory surfaced in Montgomery's mind of when he once soul-caged as a robot on the moon. Remarkably, the control only had a half-second of delay at that range. He recalled bounding through craters, seeing the sun and earth in the sky together. It was not a technology to be scoffed at, even after all the scandals and tragedies. The soul cage made you immortal, in a sense. With it, you could go and do 1,000 things ordinary people could never do in their entire lifetimes. Go places you would never otherwise go, and talk to people you would never meet. Some high-profile business people used it to simulate the feeling of meeting with faraway business partners in person. Rulers used it to inhabit android doppelgangers to protect themselves from assassination. Surgeons used it to perform life-saving operations literally anywhere in the world. Tourists used it to visit places they didn't have the money or the time to travel to. But whatever you did, Montgomery realized with a stab of melancholy, it would never be your own life. Everything, good or bad, was felt only through a thick layer of separation, an inescapable barrier to the tangible, the authentic. It was not a simulation. The world around you was real, all right. The fake thing was you. In the soul cage, experiencing life, real life, was impossible. It was quite likely for the best that only a select few were hardy enough to be soul-caged. The rain let up about 10 minutes before the time was up, but by then it had already turned the ash to mush. The droids finished cleaning right on schedule. Montgomery shepherded them back into the bus, thankful that no one tried to steal any of them today. The mechanical arm set him onto his hook, and then he felt his consciousness fade as the robot body slowly shut down, sending him back to his prison, the only place he truly lived. Not for the first time, he wished that the case of poor Lila Moon had been enough to send every soul cage into the garbage bin once and for all. If hers wasn't enough, what would be? Alright, that was Chapter 2 of Soulcage.